evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, March 18th. Israel has launched new strikes against Hamas and promised increasing military force after talks on further hostage releases stalled. Gaza's health ministry said more than 400 people were killed, making it the worst single-day toll since November 7, 2023, when 548 people died. This morning, a spokesperson for Israel's prime minister broke down why the prime minister's office launched new strikes against Hamas.
The Prime Minister and the Defence Minister instructed the Israel Defence Forces to take strong action against the Hamas terrorist organisation in the Gaza Strip. Why has Israel taken this action? For two reasons. Firstly, Hamas has rejected two concrete mediation proposals presented by the US presidential envoy, Mr. Steve Witkoff, and other mediators. Israel agreed to these mediation proposals. Hamas has rejected all of the proposals. All of the proposals. Secondly, Israel has knowledge that Hamas was planning to carry out terrorist attacks against Israel. Hamas was using the ceasefire to build up its forces and rearm to re-attack. As a result, with the approval of the government, Israel's armed forces launched precise, preemptive strikes against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad targets throughout the Gaza Strip. The following targets have been successfully hit: Hamas military commanders, officials in Hamas's leadership, terrorist cells, launch posts, weapons stockpiles, and military infrastructure used by these terror organizations, which were ready and primed to attack our people. I can confirm these strikes are ongoing.
The spokesperson continued by saying that Israel has learned their lesson and their duty is to now stop Hamas.
Ladies and gentlemen, Israel has learned our lessons from the October the 7th massacre. Israel will never again allow Hamas or any other genocidal terror force to build up its terror forces on our borders. Hamas has repeatedly vowed to repeat the October 7th massacre, and our duty is to stop them. The goal of this operation is to fulfill the war's objectives. Firstly, to release all of our hostages. Secondly, the dismantling of Hamas's military and governmental infrastructure, and the removal of the terrorist threat from Gaza to Israel's security and to its citizens. Israel will, from this point onwards, act against Gaza with increasing military strength. Increasing military strength.
Prime Minister Mark Carney says bilateral U.S. talks can't happen unless President Donald Trump knocks it off with his 51st state comments. He called Mr. Trump's annexation remarks, quote, disrespectful.
I don't think one needs to respond to every comment about another country. Look, we can stand up for ourselves. It's Canada strong. We can stand up for ourselves. We've called out those comments. They're disrespectful. They're not helpful, and they need to stop. What we're looking for, with respect to the United States, is to have a more comprehensive discussion of and negotiation of our overall commercial and security relationship. And when the United States is ready to have that conversation, we're more than ready to sit down.
Mr. Carney says that his first foreign trip as prime minister to Europe is about security and Ukraine. The prime minister also faced a series of tough questions about his personal assets and the fact that he has not disclosed his assets and may not until a federal election is held.
I follow the rules of the ethics commissioner. I'm following them well in advance of any of the requirements, as you know, because I know you know this. You know that these requirements come into effect in months. We're talking days after I became Prime Minister. So I'm complying with the rules of the Ethics Commissioner, going through the processes and all these things that are necessary. And I will remind you, and I'll remind Canadians again, that the Leader of the Opposition cannot find it. And look, you look at the questions this evening, you look at the nature of the discussions, you look at the nature of discussions I had with the President of France, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The Leader of the Opposition would not be capable of having those discussions because the Leader of Opposition refuses to get his security clearance, something that it took me a few weeks to get. And he has been the Leader of the Opposition for 3 years. So I comply with my responsibilities. I comply with the rules well in advance, and the Leader of the Opposition doesn't take his responsibilities at a time of, well, you should take these responsibilities at any time, but it's particularly remarkable given the stakes in global geopolitics at the moment.
And at that same press conference, Mr. Carney was asked about the industrial carbon tax now that Pierre Poilievre has vowed to get rid of it. Mr. Carney defended the tax, claiming that it is needed to pursue free trade deals around the world.
We're adding additional ones. We will be adding additional ones that ensure that the polluters are paying so that Canadians can receive support to reduce their own emissions. So it's a more efficient system. It works better for the large polluters. It works better for Canadians. And it also is a system that recognizes the new trading reality. So we have to be able to connect the dots, something that the opposition is totally incapable of doing, proven themselves totally incapable of doing. So on the one hand, we have our largest trading partner, as we've been discussing, attacking us, putting tariffs on us. On the other hand, we have the opportunity to diversify trade. Guess what one of the requirements is to diversify trade to the European Union? Guess what one of the requirements is to diversify trade to the United Kingdom? Guess what one of the requirements will be to diversify trade to emerging Asia? Is to have a form of price on carbon. So we are able to think one step ahead. We're able to go out and see the world. We're able to help Canadian companies prepare.
Yesterday, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's pledge to axe the industrial carbon tax was met with praise from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Their national director, Franco Terrazzano, joined us to explain their support.
Poilievre is right to oppose the hidden industrial carbon tax that makes everything more expensive and costs Canada jobs. And Poilievre is the only federal party leader to oppose all carbon taxes. So he deserves credit for that, especially given the current context where Canadian businesses are already struggling to survive massive tariffs. The last thing that Canadian businesses need is this industrial carbon tax, which will make them less competitive, right? An industrial carbon tax is just another name for a carbon tax. A carbon tax is a carbon tax is a carbon tax, and businesses don't just eat all of those costs, right? Business pass on some of the costs to Canadians through higher prices, but it also means less production here in Canada and fewer Canadian jobs. So at the end of the day, an industrial carbon tax is just a carbon tax by another name. It's a hidden carbon tax imposed on Canadian businesses that means higher prices and fewer jobs.
We also asked Franco about the overall cost of the industrial carbon tax and Prime Minister Carney's stance.
So I'm unaware of the federal government being fully transparent with Canadians on the direct price increase. Also, and probably even more important, is that Mark Carney, the now Prime Minister, has ran on tightening the industrial carbon tax and increasing the framework for the industrial carbon tax until 2035. But Carney has not been transparent with Canadians about how much that will cost at the gas pump or on their heating bill. And like we know it's not zero, Canadians understand that an industrial carbon tax is still a carbon tax on Canadian consumers and workers. Now, we do have a Leger poll that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation commissioned, and only 12% of Canadians believe Carney that businesses will pay most of the cost of an industrial carbon tax, while 70% of Canadians say the cost of the industrial carbon tax, most or some of the costs, will be passed on to consumers through higher prices. And, you know, Canadians are right. to understand that an industrial carbon tax is still a carbon tax on Canadians, because when you carbon tax refineries, that makes gas more expensive. When you carbon tax utilities, that makes home heating more expensive. And when you carbon tax fertilizer plants, that increases costs for farmers, and that makes groceries more expensive.
Coming up after the break, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew says that the search of a Winnipeg area landfill will continue for the remains of 2 murder victims.
Mercedes Myron and Morgan Harris are coming home. This is what we set out to do. I don't know if many of us knew the odds of success. I certainly was always trying to keep a realistic perspective, but it turns out bringing them home was within our grasp and something we were able to do for these families. And as we reflect on this whole experience from
The White House says that President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin have concluded a highly anticipated phone call. This comes as the U.S. administration looks to persuade the Russian leader to sign off on a 30-day ceasefire proposal. Tuesday's call also comes after Ukrainian officials last week agreed to the American proposal during talks in Saudi Arabia led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew says a search will continue at a Winnipeg area landfill for the remains of 2 murder victims. Partial remains of both Mercedes Myron and Morgan Harris have been confirmed at the landfill. When speaking to the press, Mr. Kinew said, quote, "At the end of the day, we did the right thing. We did right by these families, and we are bringing their loved ones home."
Mercedes Myron and Morgan Harris are coming home. This is what we set out to do. I don't know if many of us knew the odds of success. I certainly was always trying to keep a realistic perspective, but it turns out bringing them home was within our grasp and something we were able to do for these families. And as we reflect on this whole experience from the first times we spoke about it publicly, through all the ups and downs, to now having the news that Mercedes and Morgan are going to be coming home to their families, I hope that Manitobans and Canadians believe that this reflects positively on our province and on our country. We went through a whole heck of a lot to get to this point, but at the end of the day, we did the right thing. We did right by these families, and we are bringing their loved ones home. It's all right to share that we continue to find remains and other things that are significant potentially. So we're going to continue the search effort, and at some point, probably in the near future, we'll have that conversation with the families about when we move on to the next steps.
A search of the landfill began in December after the women's families, Indigenous leaders, and advocates pushed for years for a search of the area. The Globe and Mail's Timur Durrani joined us earlier for more on the announcement.
We've gotten to know each other a lot, all of the reporters and everybody really with the family, right, that were there throughout that time. And in the conversations we've had since, they're still processing this. It's only been a few hours since they learned about this, right? They weren't expecting any of this to happen yet. They weren't expecting this kind of good news to come out so quickly. I mean, the province had really prepared everyone to really have the search go on for at least all of this year and well into next year. So to be able to find human remains at all was a pretty big deal. But then to also identify that the human remains that they found, the 2 different sets at least, are of these 2 women. So Mercedes' family and Morgan's family, both of these families are really still processing this news. At the moment, one thing they are doing is they're trying to find any further remains of these 2 women specifically, so Morgan and Mercedes. If there's anything else out there, that would kind of create another whole set of issues, so they're going to kind of come to that when that happens, or if that happens. But right now, it's almost been a sort of natural course of saying, yeah, these women were there, so throughout all of this, there's been this kind of, it's a big idea to move, quite literally, they had to move a mountain from one part of an area over this mound of this area, and then sift through it manually and find that. Now what we're seeing is that was all the right thing to do. These millions of dollars that they spent on this was the right thing to do, because it was always something that the women's families have been questioned about, that even the premier was questioned about. I mean, we've had governments before, we've had the police here before who have said that this was unfeasible, that this would have been too dangerous or costly. And it's been shown that was not the case. It's been less than 3 months, and here we are. There's definitive proof to say that this actually was out there. These women were out there.
We also asked Timur about the extent of Mr. Canu's involvement in the findings and the significance of his goal to bring the family's loved ones home.
It was everything to the search. It's meant everything to the families. You know, whether you, I don't think this issue, and Mr. Canu's been very clear on this. This issue should have never become a political thing. You know, it was a criminal case, and then it turned into a political issue because the past PC government, they started putting up billboards, newspaper spots that they were buying. You know, radio ads that they were putting up in the election in 2023. In that fall, they were all around the province. You could see this thing, and around the country, around the world, people were watching a sitting government at the time telling people that if you vote for us, we will not do this search for these women's families. And Mr. Canu, he said that this was the humane thing to do, that this was the humanitarian thing to do. That's what made it that flashpoint issue in the election. But since then, he's made it clear it should have never entered into partisan politics. And the families have been cleared on that too. They've been dragged along with that. They wanted, whichever government was there, for them to search for this, right? Because if your sister, my daughter, you know, someone else out there goes missing in Canada, we should go looking for them, especially in a case like this where they, you know, now we found that they were murdered, that these were at the hands of a serial killer. So at this point, I think, you know, the PCs have apologized, but the families keep telling me that those apologies have not actually come to them directly. You know, so the Progressive Conservatives in the House actually, in fact, went up and said, what we did was wrong. We didn't lead with empathy. We didn't consider closure. We wanted to move forward with prosecution or think about it that way, but we didn't do the search for that reason. And now they're apologizing. But again, the families feel that that's disingenuous. These words never came to them before. And they, in fact, actually even now have not come to them directly before they get presented to the rest of the world.
He also touched on what the reaction has been from the Indigenous community in Manitoba since the remains were discovered.
I think at this point, everybody, you know, and I want to sort of go back to the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, which the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs is an organization here in Manitoba that represents 63 First Nations. So those are all the 63 First Nations here in the province. And the Grand Chief of that, she actually passed away right before any of this could have happened last year. So in September, Grand Chief Kathy Merrick, who's the first woman to lie in state here in Manitoba, given that honor last year, she suddenly passed away quite literally on the steps of the court, arguing once again for Indigenous people's rights. And she had been the fiercest advocate throughout this whole process from 2022 with the women's families to say this needed to be done. So when she died, her husband told Mr. Canu, and this is something they've all shared with me over and over again, that this was the legacy of her work, right? And but you know, she would have, if she was here today, this would have been everything to her because this was all she'd wanted for these women's families to be able to get this closure and move on. And the idea that she gets to have a funeral, a dignified funeral that all of us deserve, allows us to sort of show everyone out there that you cannot get away with these things, that if you do something like this to another First Nations woman, to another Indigenous woman, you cannot get away with this in Canada. You can't keep getting away with it without us not treating them like any other human being.
The annual pace of housing starts in February slowed 4% compared to January. Canada Mortgage and Housing says the seasonally adjusted annual rate of housing starts came in at 229,000 units for February, down from the previous month. The pace of starts for single detached homes fell 1% in February. Robert Marsilio from Valerie.ca joined us for more on the housing slowdown.
I think what politicians forget is that building houses is a business for builders. It's just too expensive for them to build homes. It's too expensive for buyers to buy the homes they're building compared to what you see on the resale side of things. So if it doesn't pencil out for a builder to kind of break ground on a project, they won't be breaking down. I think that in the short term, it's not going to have any effect on housing prices in the sense that I think people associate a slowing in starts with decreased supply, and then affordability kind of gets out of hand for people. Prices skyrocket because of that supply shortage. But again, back to the resale side of things, we're seeing more inventory. I think it's up close to 60% for this time of year in the GTA, Greater Toronto Area specifically right now. There's a lot of resale inventory to be absorbed before we're going to feel the impacts of this new supply come into market. So if there is some upside movement of prices as a result of this kind of slowing in housing starts, I don't think it's going to be for a few years, 3 to 5 years down the road once we've worked through all of this resale inventory.
We also asked Robert what can or should be done to increase housing starts, especially in Canada's major markets.
Speaking to the Greater Toronto Area specifically, I think fees, taxes, charges make up about 25% of the cost of a new home. We've seen some municipalities, Vaughan and Mississauga, change those rules, drastically reduce development charges in an effort to kind of, I guess, encourage builders to start building the supply that we will need down the road. So it just comes down to, lowering those development charges, lowering land costs somehow, lowering construction costs. Once all that starts to filter through, it'll pencil for builders to start building again. And then on the consumer side, I don't think that it's anything that any one government can do, but increasing income to afford the prices of these new homes. Because again, if it doesn't pencil out for that builder, they're not going to be breaking ground on a new project. I think it all just ties back. People need to realize that new construction is just one part of the puzzle. It's the resale housing market that's really slow and really suffering right now as well. Sellers having a hard time selling properties, and it's not just end users. It's not the traditional real estate market that you may have think of from years ago. There's a lot of speculation in the Toronto market, a lot of investors that are going to be, again, flooding the market even more so, in my opinion, with projects or units that they're intending on assigning. So I do think there's going to be some more downside to prices over the next little bit of time. And I honestly think that having a little bit of a slowing in housing starts right now isn't necessarily maybe the worst thing for people's home prices, if that's what they're worried about. In terms of improving affordability, like I said, I think regardless of what this one report said, I think we'll see some improved affordability because of prices and potentially rates coming down a little bit more in the future.
Coming up, we'll be speaking to Andrew Donaldson about whether or not U.S. President Donald Trump has the power to repeal pardons signed by Joe Biden. A French politician is calling for the U.S. to return the Statue of Liberty, but that appears unlikely to happen. Raphael Glucksmann's party has been harshly critical of U.S. President Donald Trump and accused him of delivering Ukraine to Russia on a silver platter. But French President Emmanuel Macron has been trying to temper some of Mr. Trump's policy shifts while also pushing back hard against tariff hikes. UNESCO notes that the iconic Statue of Liberty is U.S. government property, and when asked, Donald Trump's press secretary immediately shot down the suggestion.
Something different. There is now a member of the European Parliament from France who does not think the U.S. represents the values of the Statue of Liberty anymore. They want the Statue of Liberty back. So is President Trump going to send the Statue of Liberty back to France?
Absolutely not. And my advice to that unnamed low-level French politician would be to remind them that it's only because of the United States of America that the French are not speaking German right now. So they should be very grateful to our great country.
Danes are boycotting American goods and encouraging others in Europe to do the same. They're furious with U.S. President Donald Trump's calls to seize the Danish territory of Greenland. But they're also upset with Mr. Trump's threats to take control of the Panama Canal and Gaza, as well as Mr. Trump's relationship with Elon Musk. Google Trends show a spike in searches for the terms boycott USA and boycott America in Denmark, Canada, and France. And President Donald Trump is now trying to nullify former President Joe Biden's pardons, claiming that the pardons were signed with an auto pen and that he actually didn't know what he signed.
To follow up on the Biden auto pen, are those executive orders, those pardons from the former president now null and void?
Well, I think so. It's not my decision. That'll be up to a court. But I would say that they're null and void because I'm sure Biden didn't have any idea that it was taking place. And somebody was using an auto pen to sign off and to give pardons to, as an example, just one example, but the J6 Unselect Committee. They gave pardons with an auto pen. I don't think Biden knew anything about it. And what they did is they deleted and destroyed all of the information that took them over a year to get. And the reason they did that is because the information was very incriminating about them. Like Nancy Pelosi, it was determined conclusively that she knew about 10,000 soldiers and turned it down. And if we used 500 soldiers, you would have had no problem, let alone 10,000. The young lady that said that I grabbed these powerful young Secret Service agents by the neck, okay? You know that was a big hoax, it was a lie. And she admitted it, and they deleted everything. So, what they did is criminal. I think we're about to land, everybody.
Yesterday, Donald Trump's press secretary addressed the looming question about whether or not Mr. Trump can undo Mr. Biden's pardons.
Have attorneys here at the White House told President Trump that he has the legal authority to undo a pardon simply because it was signed by auto pen, as he said?
The president was begging the question that I think a lot of journalists in this room should be asking about whether or not the former president of the United States, who I think we can all finally agree was cognitively impaired. I know it took people some time to finally admit that, but we all know that to be true, as evidenced by his disastrous debate performance against President Trump during the campaign. I digress on that. But the president was raising the point that did the president even know about these pardons? Was his legal signature used without his consent or knowledge? And that's not just the president or me raising those questions, Caitlin. According to the New York Post, there are Biden officials from the previous White House who raised those questions and wondered if the president was even consulted about his legally binding signature being signed onto documents. And so I think it's a question that everybody in this room should be looking into.
We're now going to bring in Andrew Donaldson from OrdinaryTimes.com for more on the accusations. Andrew, thanks for joining us today.
Always happy to be with you, Teresa.
Now, I want to start with what you make of the claim that Biden wasn't aware of what he was actually signing. Is there any legitimacy behind this?
Well, there's two tracks to it. There's the perception issue and the legal issue. The perception issue is really easy. The people that just saw the debate, the clear cognitive decline of Joe Biden, who has been in the public eye for years and years and years, so it was very apparent to folks that he was not himself towards the end of his term, and the disastrous debate performance. So it opens it up to this. It's like, well, how much in charge was he? What is the staff doing? Legally, though, that doesn't really matter that much, and people might get shocked by that, but we have about 110 years of litigating the verdict ruling, which controls how we do pardons. The presidential pardon is one of the most absolute things in American law. So as long as he wanted it, issued it, there's been quite a bit of litigation that the actual manner, whether he signed it, delegated it to a subordinate, whatever, auto pen in this particular case, those pardons are legally valid, and it's almost impossible to try to invalidate them. But again, this is Trump making a perception problem that also leads into a lot of the other things he wants to talk about.
And what precedent would this set if Trump can undo Biden's pardons? And do you think that there would, do you think that there would be any legal action taken against people like Anthony Fauci, who Trump clearly has some problems with?
Well, that's the perception that he wants to build here, because it wouldn't just be Anthony Fauci or the January 6th committee that he has pointed out. Then you could go after some of the legislation that he signed and all that. That's why that's probably not going to go that far. But if you broke that precedent, yes, and that's what he wants to do. He wants to put in disparagement everything they did. However, remember this too. President Trump also uses an auto pen, although he hasn't used it for a pardon or for major legislation. He loves those signing ceremonies, but he is a lame duck president in his last thing, and he is somebody who has been under constant investigation pretty much ever since he got into the political scene. So I think there's going to be a self-limiting thing here too, where would he really want to attack the pardon power all that much? Because he's probably going to want to put out quite a bit of pardons on his own here in the next 3 years when he goes to leave office himself.
And who else would be targeted by Trump if the pardons are in fact void?
Well, see, this is the thing. The whole theory of Donald Trump's second presidency, a lot of it has been, I'm going to get back all the people who have punished me, whether that was false electors, whether that was the election being rigged, whether that was the January 6th committee. That list is long, and you've seen him already go after political enemies, both legally and just by the pressure of the bully pulpit of being able to talk about it. So that list is really long. And again, to loop back to why this is important, while those pardons are pretty much a universal power under American law, all anybody with a pardon's really got to do if they actually got hauled into court is to present the pardon to the court, and the court would dismiss the case. That's how it normally works. But this is another judicial fight he's probably picking to have. Look, he's already defying courts on things like immigration issues. He would probably like the circus and the distraction of these people that he considers enemies having the inconvenience of having to go through this process, even if it's not totally legal and it would get thrown out in court. He'd probably like that challenge, and it would play into some of his political rhetoric that he likes to use.
And can you help us understand why someone would accept a pardon while also claiming that they've done nothing wrong?
Yeah, so the Burdick decision in 1915, when they actually did the original one, there was some language in there that lended people to think that you would have to accept blame to get it. And another part of that big legal argument was America's Fifth Amendment protection, that you can't self-incriminate. And part of that court case was that if you get a pardon, you can no longer invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege to not incriminates. That's where some of that comes. Since then, in recent years, they have litigated that further in the appeals court, and the appeals court has come out and said, no, that is not an admission of guilt because pardons are used for multiple things besides just criminal pardons, also civil things. We've seen them for legal actions. We've seen every administration of the last few years issue them. And now Biden has kind of opened the door on what we are referring to as preemptive pardons and putting that in. Now, that's novel. That hasn't really been tried in the courts yet, but those are some of the examples of what we're dealing with here. But the case law is really strong that these pardons are pretty much irrevocable. But once you get to preemptive pardons, it's probably something that the appeals court and maybe even the Supreme Court is going to end up taking a look at and making a ruling on.
And how does the legal question here end up getting resolved? What happens next?
Well, there's not much of a legal question here. This is novel theory that's being pushed by the Trump administration. So, yeah, they're going to probably try to get it in court, maybe fast track it to the Supreme Court, get some kind of a ruling on it. On paper, there is no legal argument for any of this. It's pretty cut and dry. However, in the current environment we're in, they're going to push this novel theory. They want to push the boundaries of land. And again, this is an administration that likes to defy court orders because it plays into their ethos of we're fighting the system, we're fighting the deep state. These judges are stopping us from doing things. So they probably want to fight, even if they know they're probably going to lose it. It would play into their hands. But again, keep in the back of your mind, that rhetoric might change at the end of this Trump term because he's going to want to issue a bunch of pardons for his own folks and supporters and things like that. So just kind of bookmark this one. This rhetoric may change quite a bit down the road a bit when it refers to the Trump administration itself.
Now, you did mention that it's no secret that when Biden was leaving office, he was a bit shaky and he wasn't as sharp as he was when he started. But where is Trump's claim coming from? Is there any proof right now that Biden didn't sign any of these pardons?
Well, he did use an auto pen. We do know that. The president, and again, this has been litigated pretty well through the court system, the president can dictate what he wants done and then the manner it gets done. Legally, the president still ordered it. So whether a subordinate did it, an auto pen did it. Now, using an auto pen for really important stuff like legislation or a pardon, that's where Trump's trying to draw a distinction as opposed to just signing, ceremonial paperwork, things like this. If the president had to sign everything a president has to sign, that would all they would ever get done. So there has to be a medium there. So he's using that as a wedge issue rhetorically to say, hey, we don't know what he did or did not sign. That goes into what the Biden administration, frankly, set themselves up for by protecting President Biden's declining condition into these accusations. And now you got a political hot mess that they're trying to make into a legal thing that doesn't have a lot of legal standing, but the perception of it makes it sound a lot better than what it would actually hold up in court.
Andrew, thank you so much for the time today.
Anytime, Teresa. Thank you.
An immigration lawyer believes that the case of a Vancouver woman being detained in the United States on a denied visa is a warning for other Canadians that it's no longer business as usual when crossing the border for work. U.S. immigration lawyer Jim Hacking says that Jasmine Mooney's detention sends a strong message about the current state of U.S. border control. Mr. Hacking says that he's been advising people who aren't citizens to avoid leaving the United States since he thinks there is a high chance they won't be allowed back in. The response comes after Ms. Mooney returned to Vancouver this weekend after U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement put her in detention for over a week when she tried to cross the border near San Diego. A Montreal-based think tank has proposed that Ottawa ease the tax burden by eliminating the second tax bracket for Canadians. This would mean that the federal level, Canadians would be taxed at a rate of 15% for incomes up to $111,000. Jason Dean from the Montreal Economic Institute joined us for more on their proposal.
So, in a nutshell, I'm proposing a tax cut for the middle class. Right now they face a steep bump when they move into the second income tax bracket, which basically means earning a little more means paying a lot more. So the idea of our proposal is to, remove that hurdle and provide relief to the 8.5 million middle-class Canadians who have been overlooked by tax policy. And, even as the cost of living has been increasing. Currently, if you earn between $0 and $55,000, you pay 15% tax. But then if you earn anything more than $55,000 up to $110,000, your tax rate jumps up to 20.5%. So we're proposing to collapse the rate so that there's just one unified 15% rate up to $111,000. Our proposal will lead to roughly $1,100 per year in savings for those in that second income tax bracket. And that's very meaningful relief. It could be roughly a monthly cell phone bill. It could be a couple of babysitting sessions, or a week's groceries per month for the entire year. So it can provide very meaningful relief to the middle class who have been overlooked. So the policy would provide relief. The total amount of relief would be about $17 billion. And so that would also be the revenue loss. But that's only about 3.8% of the federal budget. And if you put things in perspective, the government currently is spending $50 billion on subsidies to electric vehicle manufacturers who are struggling. And they're also spending almost $4 billion just on the design plans for a high-speed rail. I think the key idea here, we need to think about priorities here. And I think the middle class here should be a priority and should be put first. So there's lots of wiggle room to afford this type of relief, and it's very important.
We also discussed the benefits of simplifying the tax code and making Canada more competitive with the United States.
The proposed policy also simplifies the tax code. Currently, the tax code is very complicated. There's tax credits on top of tax credits, and it makes things very confusing. So this is one little step towards simplifying our tax code. If we want a tax code that leads to more economic growth, especially in the current context we're in, we want a tax code that rewards extra work, rewards productivity, and not punishing it with a steep marginal jump in tax rates. So if we compare our federal tax rates to the United States, they are much different. In the United States, the federal tax rate is roughly 10 to 12% up to an income of about 70,000 if you convert it to Canadian dollars. That's substantially low. In Canada, immediately the federal tax rate is 15% and then jumps to 20.5%. So if we want to remain competitive with the United States, we need to lower these taxes. And there's if you look actually at if you compare similar cities in terms of median incomes between Canada and the US, it's very striking. For example, if you compare median incomes between Toronto and Chicago, they're 26% lower, and that's adjusted for inflation in Toronto than in Chicago. And it's even worse if you compare Seattle to Vancouver, where the median incomes are 40% lower.
Canada's annual inflation rate jumped from 1.9% in January to 2.6% in February. The sharp increase comes after the federal government's GST and HST tax breaks ended on a variety of household staples, common gifts, and restaurant bills in mid-February. Statistics Canada says while gas prices were up slightly from January to February, the annual comparison showed a deceleration last month, which helped to rein in the overall rise in inflation. The Consumer Price Index was up in every province, with New Brunswick and Ontario showing the fastest accelerations. Customers of the Hudson's Bay Company appear to be coming to grips with the store closing down. The company was in court on Monday, asking for permission to begin a liquidation of all of its stores as early as Tuesday. Susan Carpenter, shopping at a Bay store in Edmonton, still thinks that the outlet is a vital part of Canada and the country's history. An Ontario judge says he's on hold with his decision for now while he considers the company's case. A $50 million contingency fund to deal with the U.S. tariff threats has caused New Brunswick's projected deficit for the coming fiscal year to balloon to nearly $600 million. New Brunswick's finance minister says that the daily pivoting in the direction on tariffs from U.S. President Donald Trump makes the contingency fund necessary. The provincial Liberal government's first budget since winning the election in October comes amid a trade war with the United States and the threat of a sweeping 25% tariff on goods from Canada. Hungarian lawmakers have passed a law banning pride events and allowing authorities to use facial recognition software to identify attendees. The measure was passed today with 136 votes in favor and 27 against. The law is backed by the Hungarian Prime Minister's party and their minority coalition partner, the Christian Democrats. It was rushed through Parliament just one day after being introduced. The law challenges Hungary's assembly rules, making it illegal to hold or attend events that go against the country's controversial child protection law. The law bans the depiction or promotion of homosexuality to minors under 18. NASA's 2 stuck astronauts are heading home now that the replacement crew has arrived at the International Space Station.
You see Butch Wilmore on the far left, in the center of your screen, Alexander Gorbanov, Nick Hague on the far right. They will settle into their respective seats aboard Freedom. Its countdown clocks here in Mission Control are ticking backward toward the time of the command to initiate the opening of hooks.
Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams launched last June as the first test pilots for Boeing's new Starliner capsule and quickly encountered trouble. 9 months later, they're flying back on SpaceX and due back on Tuesday. The pair each had 2 space flights behind them, including months-long stints at the space station before signing up as Starliner's first crew. Irish eyes aren't smiling on Conor McGregor's St. Patrick's Day bromance with President Donald Trump. The mixed martial arts fighter anti-immigration remarks and criticism of the Irish government during a visit to the White House on Monday were slammed by Ireland's leaders, who said that he doesn't speak for the country or its citizens.
What is going on in Ireland is a travesty. Our government is the government of zero action with zero accountability. You know, our money is being spent on overseas issues that has nothing to do with the Irish people. The illegal immigration racket is running ravage on the country. There are rural towns in Ireland that have been overrun in one swoop, that have become a minority in one swoop. So issues need to be addressed, and the 40 million Irish Americans, as I said, need to hear this, because if not, there will be no place to come home and visit.
Irish Prime Minister Michael Martin wrote on the social media platform X, Conor McGregor's remarks are wrong and do not reflect the spirit of St. Patrick's Day or the views of the people of Ireland. Harvard undergraduate tuition will be free for students from families making $200,000 or less starting next fall. The university announced on Monday in its latest efforts to provide an Ivy League education to those who might otherwise be priced out. Attending Harvard will be completely free for students from families making $100,000 or less, with the university committing to cover housing, health insurance, and travel costs between campus and home. A British Columbia man has returned a book to the University of British Columbia Library 64 years late, but he had a good tale to tell. The library received a package from 83-year-old Robert Murray in the mail with the book and a $100 check for late fees. He had a story about how the book helped him. He says that the 1931 edition of a handbook for campers and wilderness travelers likely saved his and his son's life. Mr. Murray credits the book for likely saving them from hypothermia on a trip with a faulty compass that involved a soaking from an intense rainstorm. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on social media. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us on Forum Daily News. We'll see you next time. Good night, Canada.